Hello, everyone. It is with great excitement that I'm here today to announce the first panel regarding the longevity investment landscape. So, as you probably know, because you are here today, longevity is an industry that touches upon every single one of us. And it will radically transform the world as we know it. So today we will discuss how do startups bridge the Death Valley and actually reach real people on the other side to transform their lives. So I'm happy to announce today with me Sasha Hyder of Global Ventures, Professor Nick Tolvinsky of Yale and US College, Max Unfried of VitaDAO, and Pierre-Antoine Mudry of Rejuveron. The startup life. Technical issues. Just a second. Yeah. For introduction, could you all please just, in a sentence or two, introduce yourself and let the audience know what you're working on in the field of longevity and what personally excites you about this field?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Sasha. I'm one of the partners at Global Ventures, a generalist VC focused on the Middle East and Africa. We're one of the largest healthcare investors in the region. Out of our 58 portfolio companies, 14 of them are health tech. And I'm personally really excited about longevity in the context of emerging markets where there's a healthcare provision gap. And I think preventative healthcare can really help to bridge some of the challenges that we see in this region.
Great. Nick?
Hi, I'm an academic, so I don't really do startups as such, but I'm relatively new to the longevity field. I come from a developmental biology background, so it's quite new to me and a very exciting new field to be a part of.
And hi again, so Pierre-Antoine, I'm at Rejuveron Life Science, and yes, I've been, working on building startups and therapeutics program around longevity for the last 3.5 years. So, I guess I have some experience in the topic of the day.
Hi everyone, I'm Max. In the longevity space, I'm having kind of two roles. I am an academic. I'm at the National University of Singapore, finishing up my PhD there on aging biology. And my other foot is in the world of VitaDAO, which is like a crypto project that funds aging and longevity research. And what we mainly do is we actually look at those last 1 or 2 experiments that have to be done at university that has to be funded and then can be spun out into valuable companies that target aging directly and modulate biology in a way that we can reverse or slow aging.
Perfect, thank you. So Sasha, first question is for you. You said, for a startup to be successful, the boldness and originality of founders needs to be reinforced with a data-validated product market fit. How does that translate to the longevity industry, given that majority of the startups have a very long timeline to actually get to the market?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the type of investor. So I'll caveat my response with we are obviously a generalist Series A investor, which is vanilla VC, a 7 to 10 year fund period, which means that products need to commercialize and we have to be able to exit them within that time period. And so I think that there's kind of, for the innovations in longevity that are very biotech focused or have significant deep tech involved in them, some of the timelines to commercialization are a little bit too long for the way that funds like ours are structured. And when we would think about longevity, it would perhaps be more in the context of, apps or other types of technology that has already sort of reached commercialization, is already in the hands of consumers or in a B2B context. And that's sort of where we would play. And I think that sort of interestingly, in this region specifically, we don't necessarily have the depth of biotech-focused VCs similar to what you would see in other markets, but there are more innovative structures that work with and are created specifically for products like longevity-focused products, which have longer timelines to commercialization. So I would say it just really depends on the funder in question, and there is a space in which generalist and sort of vanilla VC can play in the longevity space, but sort of traditionally there are more specific investors that might be better capital partners.
This brings me to Pierre and the Redfords of Rejuveron to not just invest, but also create an ecosystem that helps accelerate the startup's journey. Can you explain a little bit more about the entrepreneurial scientist that you're looking for when you're going to, accelerate a startup's journey?
Yes, I mean, it's always a bit of a unicorn, right? You need to find someone that's, very technically minded, very qualified, typically a PhD in specific areas, and that also has the knack and the drive to be part of a company at a very early stage. So, by the way, I have one next to me, Max, who I think is amazing. But ultimately, we found them, or we find them in sometimes already working in the private sector and specialized in areas that we think are very important. So one of our the companies that we created, which is focusing on brain vasculature, we identified a very promising neuroscientist that was actually already had done work in the corporate sector, and so had this interest, and then we created a special position for him within Rejuveron, which was entrepreneur in residence, and gave him basically a year to come up with an idea, which he did, and that was basically the genesis of a company focusing on brain health. So that's an example. So I would say ideally, you can also look at people that have worked in the startup sector, some are already in the longevity space, and that have this background, this scientific background that you also need. But it is difficult, and part of the way of appealing to them is to becoming known, so that they also just come to us, right? Because that's also a way of finding people.
And how about people with non-scientific background? Do you believe they can make the transition into the scientific world?
I mean, you can certainly work in startups focusing on longevity if you're not, let's say, from a life science background. I'm actually from a finance and math background, and here I am, right? So I would say, of course, that when it comes to, I mean, we're doing therapeutics, which is I would say very, very sort of science heavy. But when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty, scientific work being done, certainly you can't reinvent yourself. You don't come from that area. But if you want to get involved in the space and create a company, that's, you need scientific acumen, but you also need commercial awareness. And I think, a lot of combinations are possible.
And Nick, coming to you, for the last 20 years, you've amassed you're a really accomplished scientist in the field of, you researched cancer, then you went into Wnt signaling pathways related to the embryonic development. Can you tell us, since you're looking at the beginning of the life as we know it, how does that apply to the next stages of life? And how do you see the translation of such science into the real world?
So I can answer this in sort of an anecdote. So when I started working at a cancer center, we worked on drugs to reduce tumor burden. And one of the things that came out of that is you have an oncogene, you target it, you seem to reduce the size of cancer, but you occasionally get these strange other effects that happen along. And the particular molecules that we worked on at the time, essentially, you cannot target the tumor that way, because it leads to so many detrimental issues in bone mass and many other systems. because it turns out that these molecules are required for longevity. So if you now turn it around in a patient without a tumor and you activate these molecules rather than inactivating them, you actually can get lifespan extension. You can get, as we were talking about, intestinal regeneration, which is one of the sort of big things in regenerative medicine, because you get a lot of intestinal problems later in life. And so by adding these molecules back, you can actually do regeneration, which you couldn't do before. So this is kind of an anecdotal way of saying, like, you start on one thing that may not work the way you thought it would, and then you completely accidentally, because of something that happens, pivot into something completely new. And that's, as a basic scientist, like doing these kinds of fun experiments, you end up where you end up.
Max, would you like to add on that, seeing as you are balancing being both a scientist and also very deeply into the entrepreneurial world? What is your personal opinion or your personal experience of balancing the two?
So I think it's a great experience because in a way for the business people, you're the smart scientist, and for the scientists, you're the guy who knows about business. So you can help both worlds. That's the one thing. And you can learn from both worlds, which is also interesting because it's two different ways of thinking about the problem, right? Scientists, in a way, are like more purists. They like the beauty of science, what it creates, what is hidden, what it finds. And the business people are thinking, okay, how do we make that science useful, create therapeutics, make people healthier, and on the way also make money, right? And those two things often go together, but not always, right? Especially the communication between those two things. And then there's obviously the institutions of academia. There's like the institutions of like financing, and in a way there's like the institutions of government. And if you want to bring therapies to market, you have in a way interact with all of them. For example, I would say there's like a lot of good science buried in bureaucracy. That in a lot of universities, they're like good scientists, they produce good results, and then it stays there, and there's almost like this kind of zombie kind of graveyard in universities where good science is not being spun out into companies. So in a way, you need like a gravedigger going there, talking to those tech transfer offices, finding this good science, and then evaluating the intellectual property that often the university holds, and see, can we get this from the university and put into a business and build a team around that? Because often the scientists are more interested in doing the science and they don't want to run the business. So bringing all those factors together that then, in a way, create a startup company, right? This means you need the scientists that do the science, you need the business people who understand the business, but in the future you also like need people who understand regulations and lawyers that really enable then clinical trials and all the roads toward that. So it's kind of cool that you always, and like Pierre earlier said, right, there's like, you can transition to the longevity space with your skill set and help on whatever branch you're like good at. And with that, bringing therapeutics to market and using your skill set to make that happen.
Great. And Pierre, could you please add a little bit? Max mentioned that regulation is a very, it's a topic that must be mentioned when we are talking about commercialization of longevity solutions. How does Rejuveron look at that when you're choosing your startups for the ecosystem? And how do you help them breach or go through the regulatory framework to actually go to the market?
Yeah, thanks. So I think there are two ways through which we think around regulation. So the first one is we have to play along the rules of the big drug approval regulators, like the FDA in Europe, the EMA, in the US, the EMA in Europe, because ultimately, when you're doing drugs, these are the biggest markets. So these are the ones that you actually need to crack if you want to have a blockbuster. And so, there's no it's not rocket science to an extent. It's you need to have people within the organization that have decades of experience navigating those regulators. And when we set out about creating some of our therapeutic programs and ultimately the companies that house them, one of the key things we look at is, okay, are we actually solving a problem that they have? You know, has this particular disease, which we know is caused by this process of aging, is it actually considered by the regulator to be a really high unmet medical need or a pressing issue? And if it's yes, then it makes your life much easier, because then you can get a breakthrough therapy sort of like level, or you can you can get an orphan disease designation, or this sort of like fast track items that the regulators can give you. So that's the first thing. It's understand that the regulators are calling the shots, work with them, and have people that have the experience. So for instance, at Rejuveron, we are working with the former global head of legal effectively at Roche, whose life was to deal with those guys, right? So that helps us because we know how to approach them. And then the second point, which I think is probably much more forward-looking in terms of dealing with regulation, is understand that there are places of which, Abu Dhabi is one, and even though it's in its infancy, but there are places where there is a willingness at the highest level to think hard around how do we create a longevity-friendly regulatory framework, and what would it actually look like? How do you flesh it out? In practice, what do we need? So for instance, for us, and this is true for any place or company which is dealing with drugs, it's that the fact that it's costing 1 to 1.5 billion to get a drug to commercialization is an enormous hurdle, right? Because it effectively creates a system which it plays in the hands of big pharma, because big pharma are the only players that can actually spend that amount of money. But the reality, for instance, is that the biggest chunk of the cost is around the phase 3, which is easily 500 plus million, and sometimes close to 1 billion. And also the cost of insuring the patients, or like the people on which we actually test those drugs, right? And so these are costs. Like, for instance, phase 3 is a relatively new invention, and so there is a very strong argument to be made that you could actually do away with it, or at least start commercializing the drug after a successful phase 2, and then in parallel run the phase 3, financing it on the money that you're actually making on the drug sales already, right? So this is, for instance, an idea. I'm not saying it's the idea, but I'm saying this is an idea. And there are also other jurisdictions where it's not as expensive to insure patients, for instance, right? So there needs to be a work done with the regulators of forward-looking jurisdictions, of which the UAE is one, once again, so that we can actually create a more favorable regulatory framework, which ultimately lowers the cost of producing drugs and also enables us to commercialize things faster, because ultimately, we don't have that much time.
I think we are all racing for time here, right? So this brings me, Sasha, to another quote of yours. And you said that the unintended consequences of billionaires trying to beat death could be the salvation of the masses. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, 100%. I wrote about this earlier this year, and this is actually how Nicolina and I crossed paths, because it was like something that was very fascinating to me. So I think conventionally, when you think about longevity, I always thought about, and I mentioned this, just like the idea of, rich people trying to freeze their body, cryogenically freeze their bodies, and be able to live into the future. And it's something that the average person doesn't have to think about, right? And actually, by the way, I did find out you can freeze your body. And on top of that, you can freeze just your head, with the belief being that science is going to catch up eventually, and they're going to be able to grow you a new body. So all your precious thoughts will be saved. And increasingly, we spend quite a bit of time mapping out the healthcare landscape across the Middle East and Africa. And I think that what we found was that there's a fundamental healthcare provision gap. And this is true for many emerging markets, which is quality, cost, and sort of access to healthcare is like a fundamental challenge across our markets, right? There's just simply not enough doctors, there's not enough facilities, there's not enough high quality healthcare provision across our markets. Comparatively, if you look at more developed markets, what you will see is that in the US and Europe, we have a preventative healthcare system, or a disease care system, which means that you become sick and then the healthcare system has to figure out, how do I make you better? right? And I think that, what that has resulted in is essentially very little focus on how do we stop people getting sick in the first place. And there's a very, very strong and clear correlation between aging and becoming sick, right? In the US, 50% of healthcare expenditure is on people who are older than 60, right? And when you think about that, the burden of healthcare, the older you get, is something that, could be prevented through some longevity medicine. Comparatively, and also just like importantly, this region has the highest burden of non-communicable diseases in the world, right? The instance of obesity and then that leading to diabetes, cancer, hypertension is massive in this region, right? And I think that similarly, because of the way certain lifestyle habits have been set up, certain cultural things, genetics, just based on how the region has developed over the last, 100, 200 years, means that we are slowly moving towards a disease care system which is trying to treat people who have type 2 diabetes versus trying to stop them from getting it in the first place. And I think that the perspective that I have is that, I think that maybe in more developed markets where it's a bit more entrenched in terms of how healthcare systems are set up, there's different stakeholders, the pharma companies, the insurance companies, and the various stakeholders who benefit from and have continued to benefit from the healthcare system being set up in that way, there is less of an incentive for a fundamental shift to happen, right? And I think here and in this region where, we don't necessarily have like the infrastructure to set up 100 hospitals overnight. I mean, I would say the GCC is very different to Africa. What can we do in terms of longevity medicine, preventative healthcare, fundamental mindset shift, using data that we have about ourselves, both genetically and otherwise, to be able to tell us what we're predisposed to and stop that from becoming a healthcare cost or burden. And I think that, increasingly we're starting to see ideas and thoughts around, hey, an insurance company would much rather help you to pay for your gym membership and help pay for a meal plan than figure out how they're supporting you on insulin for the rest of your life once you've developed type 2 diabetes. So that's really where that thinking comes from.
Yeah, there is a need to really bring the science behind these interventions together into preventative way. And in regards to that, Nick, can you tell me a little bit, coming from the scientific background, what are the incentives for scientists to make the leap into the entrepreneurial world? Or perhaps is the ecosystem making the scientists too comfortable in the environment where they are at?
So I think that's exactly the issue. Once you're an academic at a certain standing, it's very comfortable life. There's no real need to do anything entrepreneurial so to actually bridge that gap, you have to have something you really believe in that's going to, actually, you need to be altruistic, right? You need to think that changing the way the Alzheimer's antibody treatment is administered, for example, can be a big transformative healthcare thing, right? Just as a random example. And all of these things can happen, but it takes a lot of energy, right? And you have a lot of other responsibilities, right? You may have to teach, you may have to get grants. It's not a natural transition. So I don't really know how you would redo the incentives, but there would have to be like a really big payoff to promote this.
Now, Max, at VitaDAO, what you are doing is really shaping an ecosystem. And what is written is that when startups are applying for the VitaDAO program, they must articulate the commercialization plan for the project. However, on the other hand, VitaDAO particularly wants to fund the products that are moonshots, potentially revolutionary. How do you bridge that gap? How do you select projects that are both moonshots but still have a commercialization plan, especially given that the funding is still primarily given for R&D?
So if you look at how academic science projects in a way are funded, right? Or like even what academics are interested in researching, you could put it into like two different classes, right? One is like fundamental research that is almost done just for the sake of doing science, and that's perfectly fine, right? That's like trying out new things that just because it's interesting, right? Because people are curious. And some of those things at the end will actually lead to novel revolutionary medicines, but it's like very hard to gauge which will work, which won't work, right? And then you have like projects that are like more already like in a translational phase, right? Or where you could already see this go somewhere, right? This is maybe certain drugs have already been tested in mouse models, right? And have shown benefits in mice, or mechanisms are a bit more understood, right? Yet they're like still in a way moonshots, because there's like still like a high risk associated with it, that is like there will be side effects if it's going to humans. We don't fully understand it. It seems to be something that does something, but we don't know what. And in a way, that's what we're targeting, right? It's like, well, there's already enough data that it shows there's like something going on, but we need, in a way, one or two more experiments to verify it and validate it and say, okay, this actually can go somewhere, this can move to humans and thereby can be commercialized. While when we talk about commercialization, it's mainly about, okay, does this impact human health and lifespan if it were to work in humans? And so it's obviously a balance, right? And we're like not fortune tellers. Probably a lot of those things that we currently funded or working on, it's biotech after all. It might still fail, right? But we hope that at least a few of those things will work out.
Great. That is one example of how to build the ecosystem that actually supports this fundamentally important translation of science into the real world. So to wrap up, I would ask each of you to just say one sentence, a takeaway message for the audience to take home, and take into account there are also startups here who might be motivated by this panel to pursue their mission further, or scientists looking to take that leap but needing a little bit of a support.
Yeah, I mean, from a funding perspective, especially for vanilla VC in the region, which is your standard venture capital and it's not biotech focused, what I would say is that a lot of the time, founders in the longevity space, or those who have like a significant foundational science as part of their core value offering or proposition, haven't yet figured out the translation layer to more mainstream VC, which is the bulk of the capital in this market. And what I mean when I say that is like when we receive many longevity businesses, what we receive in the decks is like decks of just chemical symbols, right? And we're just like, how the hell are we supposed to interpret what this means, right? So I think that there really needs to be, speaking about, you know, that business time scientific profile. When you're raising in the discovery stage, it's very different to when you're raising in the path to commercialization stage, and know your audience and pitch to and spend time with people. Things that you might take for granted in terms of your research or your product and your understanding of science. Don't assume the person on the other side of the table always has that understanding, and honestly try to make it as easy to understand as possible is the only thing I would say.
So I'd say one of the things that is hopeful is people like Max, because companies, especially startups or even bigger companies, should consider, sending people out into the academic world just to see what the ideas are. And you don't necessarily have to go and spend an entire 5 years of a PhD to do this, but you could, come into a laboratory that you think has some good ideas and see whether any of these things make sense for commercialization. Because the laboratory itself may not be even thinking in that direction or, have the tools to do that. But people from the outside who could come in would be a much better place to evaluate and, think about the commercialization aspects.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say to budding entrepreneurs is just try to get a clear idea of what you want to do and what's your DNA. It's one thing to be working on building drugs. It's a completely different one if you're doing an app to track biomarkers or just to sort of like have all your health signals in there. These things are very different, and the constituents that you're going to have to speak to are also going to be very different because longevity is a catch-all term, but in fact, it's a huge universe with plenty of let's say, ecosystems that are working on actually very different timelines and targets. So I think it's important to realize that and be thoughtful in how you actually approach which part of the ecosystem you belong into, and then who do you need to speak to, who could actually fund you, or where could you find potential employees and stuff like that.
Maybe if you start personally thinking or envisioning, how would like a future without age-related diseases look like, or like where aging is optional? And if this vision or this idea excites you, start working on it and maybe drop what you're currently doing and slowly make a shift towards longevity with whatever skills that you have.
Great. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Are you sort of thinking only about new drugs or new things, or what about the whole lot of things you do for longevity? And if you want to be commercial, then means that you want to extend not only to rich people and wealthy, which doing it themselves now and looking for it, but if you want to access the population, then you need to work with public health in the same time, because I have experience of doing this for building genetic services in Oman, and it took 20 years, constant work and doing so many things, and it's acceptance by the people which drives it, and it's need a lot of work to make them understand what it means and how it works, and supporting, and then doing studies in the same time. So it's doing many things, but it's possible, but it needs a lot of energy to bring it out.
I can think of one way to answer that question just in the context of like some of my own personal thesis on longevity, which is, I guess it's dependent on a couple of things from a public health perspective. To your point, population data, like what do you actually know about the populations within your markets? And that's something definitely that public health organizations can enforce. And we're seeing it here in Abu Dhabi, for example. You can go and get your genome mapped as a person. You understand what you are predisposed to, and having that bank of information helps healthcare professionals understand sort of as a heads up what it is that's wrong with you. The second piece of it is like, I think the regulator and the regulator for insurance companies specifically has an important role to play here, which is, I guess, like maybe shifts towards, as I mentioned, more functional medicine, lifestyle changes, those kinds of things sooner for the average person, using the technology that we have available to us, as we mentioned, like apps, tracking your markers on a more consistent basis to stop people getting sick in the first place is really, as I think about it, the easiest way you can reduce that cost burden later on and make it more accessible to the masses. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
So one of the points you raised is with new drugs. And one of the things that is a big focus is actually repurposing drugs. So things, as I said, that had an effect that we weren't expecting, and then trying it out. The most famous of these is, of course, Viagra, right? That's the drug that was meant to do something else, and then made a ton of money for Pfizer from completely different side effect, right? And so a lot of these drugs, you can look at the way they were applied, for example, oral versus some other way, and maybe the way they were administered was wrong, right? So there's lots of repurposing, reassessing that can be done. And that's definitely done in the academic space.
So yeah, on this note, we will be ending this panel here. I would like to thank all of you for joining me today for this really beautiful discussion. And there will be plenty of time now for more questions and discussions afterwards. As we are heading for a break, there is coffee and some more stuff in the background.